Hoy día tenemos a Oliver Marchart, profesor de filosofía política en la Universidad de Viena, y vamos a conversar un poco acerca de la relación entre estética y política. Oliver, casi por tradición, a la dimensión estética de la crítica, asociada a la performance artística, se le suelen oponer formas normativas de cuestionamiento social. Según esta división, mientras que una crítica normativa buscaría reconstruir principios y valores aceptados, tácitamente al menos, para usarlos luego como criterio de adecuación con las prácticas e instituciones sociales, el carácter más bien espontáneo e imaginativo propio del arte sería más radical, al no presuponer un substrato institucional. En tu caso, sin embargo, no parece haber una distinción tan fuerte entre ambas dimensiones, aunque sí se percibe cierta desconfianza con respecto a un excesivo normativismo y una opción por posiciones agonísticas asociadas al pensamiento de Mouffe o de Laclau. Mi pregunta es, ¿en qué sentido te parece que lo estético puede tener un mayor potencial crítico y de este modo fomentar un tipo de política más radical?
Well, let me first thank you for posing these questions to me, and I'm very glad we are meeting at this intercontinental virtual space and to continue our previous discussions and theoretical conversation. So it's very hard for me to address your question. On the one hand, we need to clarify what we mean by aesthetics or aesthetic criticism, but aesthetics in general, because there are different ideas what aesthetics actually could mean. And on the other hand, you have addressed the normativity problem. So let me first tackle the question whether there is, one could phrase it that way, whether there is a normative deficit in aesthetic practices, because aesthetic practices do not necessarily go to the explicit or implicit normative grounds of which on which they are based. And in that sense, in fact, you're right, I'm not a normativist. So for me, the political and the aesthetic, and we would have to discuss how they interrelate, the political and the aesthetic on the other hand, on the one hand, and the normative on the other hand, have to be distinguished if by the normative we mean to look for transcendent grounds that are based in, say, an institution which transcends the realm of political struggles and the historical realm of the institution of particular given norms. Now, these norms, when we speak about transcendent norms, in my usage of the term transcendence, we do not necessarily need to think of religious norms or religious forms of transcendence to ground norms in, say, communicative rationality would, in my usage of the term, also be a way of transcending the establishment of norms by disentangling them from the historical political process by which these norms were instituted. So I have absolutely no problem speaking about the question of norms and normativity, but I would, for analytic purposes, try to disentangle them from the realm of politics, while on the other hand, I would mingle them with the realm of politics, because every normative principle is politically instituted, and every political practice is based on some normative principles, but not on transcendent normative principles, but on, in turn, politically instituted principles. So what we have here is a sort of circle, if you wish, between the political and the normative. And when we have managed to disentangle these two spheres, we can come to the point where we can say, okay, but in a particular practice, we always find both. Every politics is to a certain degree normative, every norm is to a certain degree political. Now, having said that, the question is what to make of artistic practices and the normative grounds to which artistic practices may or may not rely on. And here, I think art has its own, of course, its own ways of activating norms which are societal norms, which are political norms. And for me, it is very important to, in a way, differentiate my approach to art and to aesthetics from the usual traditional idea of thinking or criticizing art or thinking about art in terms of art criticism or in terms of art theory or in terms of aesthetics as a philosophical discipline. Because in my view, and in a certain sense, this follows from what I've said so far, in my view, artistic practices and the aesthetic realm as such, very much like cultural practices, are deeply entangled in political struggles and political conflicts. They are not located at a realm outside the realm of the political. They are deeply ingrained with political struggles over norms, for instance, and over the way we look at the world, a worldview, or what Antonio Gramsci called common sense. And therefore, it is important to see in art and in aesthetic practices a political activity which in a certain way reflects upon the political nature of the world. And the same can be said about aesthetics. And this leads me to my second point. Speak about aesthetics. We may also refer to the philosophical discipline of aesthetics. And I have published this book recently, which is called Conflictual Aesthetics. And in this book, I try to, in a way, try to tackle this problem of the aesthetic from a view on artistic practices. But I do not really engage with the philosophical discipline of aesthetics. But if we think about the philosophical discipline of aesthetics, we will immediately realize from a Gramscian perspective, and that's basically my perspective at the end of the day, that aesthetics as a philosophical discipline is another way of doing political theory or political ontology even, like many other philosophical disciplines. Why? If you think of, for instance, Antonio Negri's work on Descartes or his work on Spinoza, the main claim in this work is that ontology, as in the case of Descartes or Spinoza, ontology is always political ontology. So when philosophers think about being, no matter whether they think about it in an epistemological way or in an ontological way proper, whenever philosophers think about the very being of the world, they think about the political. That's Negri's point, because the being of the world is political. It is established through, not politics in the narrow sense, but through hegemonic struggles. And for that reason, the philosophical discipline of ontology is always political ontology. I would like to make the same claim about aesthetics. The philosophical discipline of aesthetics is another way of thinking about the political nature of the world. It is even another way, historically, of thinking about political practice. Just take the example of Schiller. Now, you know that Gramsci came to his idea of hegemony because of the historical situation of a failed revolution. So the Russian Revolution failed, and Gramsci said, okay, this was politics in the mode of a war of maneuver. We move on and we capture the Winter Palace. This doesn't work anymore in the societies of the European West because of the entrenched system of the civil society with all the civil society and societal institutions and so on. So we must move to a war of maneuver within that civil society, and we have to think about that in terms of hegemony. So hegemony means, dominance in the sphere of culture, in the way we think about the world, in the cultural institutions, which are also civil societal institutions. And Schiller, as a reaction to the, in a certain way, failed French Revolution, it actually did not fail so much, but it certainly he was right in thinking about the complete impossibility of a French revolutionary style revolution in the German countries. For Schiller did the same thing. He moved to the realm of culture. He moved to the realm of aesthetic education because political revolution was impossible. So if political revolution is impossible, you move to the realm of culture in order to prepare political revolution. This is what happened with the bourgeoisie. And this is the ground and the historical ground of the emergence of aesthetics as a philosophical discipline. The bourgeoisie invented for itself the realm of autonomous culture. So the autonomy of art, as one of the classic ideas of aesthetics as a philosophical discipline, the autonomy of art is less autonomous than we think about it, because art and the idea of autonomy served the bourgeoisie in the process of its own emancipation as a particular political tool, you may say a weapon, in their struggle of emancipation. It is very important for the bourgeoisie to establish these. Think of Habermas's famous habilitation thesis about the emergence of the public sphere, of the bourgeois public sphere. It's very important for the bourgeoisie, before having conquered political power, to establish in the realm of culture, in the realm of art, an autonomous sphere where they could prepare their own hegemony, taking over hegemony from the aristocratic class, establishing a new idea of art.
Es conocido que uno de tus principales temas de investigación es justamente la relación entre el arte y la política. Y además, en contra de una corriente bastante extendida, a la que te has referido también, tú crees, me parece, que no todo arte es intrínsecamente político. De un modo similar como no toda acción social es política per se. Pero, sin embargo, has afirmado paradigmáticamente, repito, en tu último libro, que las prácticas de activismo político históricamente siempre han acompañado al arte burgués. Para resumir entonces, ¿cómo puede entenderse desde tu punto de vista la relación entre arte y política?
Well, yeah, exactly that. I think we have to completely reshape our thinking about the relation between art and politics. On the one hand, art is intrinsically political, as I just explained it. It is a way of engaging with the world, and every way of engaging with the world is, to a certain degree, political. But then, this classical aesthetic idea, let's call it the bourgeois idea, I know that's simplistic, but for the sake of it, just call it like that, in a classical Marxist sense, the bourgeois idea of art, attributing the notion of autonomy to artistic practices, this idea disentangles art from politics and from the political nature of art, and portrays art as if art was located at an entirely different sphere, a sphere disentangled from society, if you wish. Now, you only need to read 3 pages of Bourdieu to know that this is not the case. You know, art is very much, as I said, a weapon in the hands of the bourgeoisie. And for that reason, the bourgeoisie needs this notion of autonomy. Now, if we take Bourdieu into account, in a certain way politicize Bourdieu, we may come to a different take on art and on art's relation to politics. Because I think we must not stop at this level of the, say, general politicality of art. Precisely because something happened in aesthetic theory in the last decade or so, that some theorists, Jacques Rancière, for instance, who is strictly anti-Bourdieuian, if you wish, emerged to make this claim that art, by the very nature of being art, is political. Okay, no quarrel with that. But then this implies that other practices are not as political as art. Why is art political? Because it engages symbolically with the world. It rearranges the world on a symbolic level. But what about sports? What about advertisement? What about other spheres of culture, like the popular spheres of culture? Do they not engage symbolically with the world? Do they not change basically the symbolic structure, or shift the symbolic structure of the world, at least to some degree? Of course they do. So art is not special in this regard. And aesthetic theory always has this penchant towards portraying art as being something totally special. And this is a remnant of the history of bourgeois aesthetics, to disentangle art from other spheres of action. What we need to do today is to bring together art and politics again. And in order to bring together art and politics, to sort of re-weaponize art, if you wish, but for emancipatory purposes, if we want to bring them together, we have to get rid of this idea that art is always already political, because this in fact depoliticizes art. Because then every art, every painting on the wall is political in and by itself, but then nothing is political. And for that reason, we need to speak about truly political art. And by that, I mean explicitly political art. And in my book, I refer to basically all sorts of artistic practices that emerged in the last couple of decades. But if you look at artistic activism, the moment when art and politics in actual fact connect, you realize that artistic activism is not a phenomenon that emerged in the last decades. It emerged with the bourgeois revolution. And the very first political artistic activist was Jacques-Louis David, the painter. During the French Revolution, he moved from being a painter to becoming a deputy of the Jacobins. So he became a politician in the strict sense of the term. And for that reason, from then on, artists always crossed that line. Artists always, in all the revolutions of the 19th century and then in the 20th century, and we tend to look only at these grandiose moments of, like, say, the Russian constructivists or whatever, and think, oh, at that moment art became political. No, it was always there. And today, if you look at social movements, at democratization movements, artists will always be involved in these movements, and they will always contribute to these movements by bringing in their particular skills, their creative skills, whatever, or simply by acting as political activists. So there is an intrinsic connection between art and politics through political activism. Of course, this doesn't cover all the practices of art production. It is a particular practice of art production. But it is very important in the history of art, and it is totally underrated in history of art. So I'm not an art historian. I'm not going to write the history of political art, but I think someone should do it, because what we need is a paradigm shift from this totally depoliticized art history to a history that brings to the foreground the actual political practices of artists over the centuries.
Volviendo a lo que mencionabas al inicio de la entrevista, el carácter ontológico que claramente tiene tu posición podría sugerirnos que todo proceso de constitución social, cultural, simbólico e institucional tiene dos lados. Un lado positivo, como el resultado de estos procesos, y un lado negativo, como un espacio complejo y no saturado desde el cual es posible iniciar prácticas de activismo político asociadas precisamente al arte. Sin embargo, presentada de esta manera, esta posición podría sugerir, como me parece que ocurre en Rancière, que hablamos de dos dimensiones distintas: lo institucional, lo fáctico u óntico por un lado, y una especie de exterioridad que permanece como una sombra o como un residuo y que posibilita justamente desde afuera la recomposición de la sociedad. Tu posición, tengo la sospecha, es algo más inmanentista que esto, porque al menos en lo que se refiere al arte, la obra producida contendría en sí misma ambos momentos. A partir de esto, me gustaría preguntarte si tú te identificas con una aproximación de este último tipo, o si más bien consideras que siempre se requiere postular una exterioridad desde la cual garantizar la crítica social, o en todo caso, si crees que es necesario oponer ambas alternativas, o pueden más bien ser complementarias.
Yes, in a certain sense, my position is similar to what Nancy would call transimmanence, or what Ernesto Laclau means when he speaks about failed immanence. So in a certain way, society is a sphere of immanence. I would agree to that. There is no such thing as a super hard transcendent point from where you could look at society. Obviously, you're always immersed in it. And for that reason, your political practices, as well as your aesthetic practices, are also always immersed in society. On the other hand, society is structured through what Laclau in the history, which is basically a Marxist history of thinking of that, would have called antagonism. And the function of antagonism is, I think, very important if we think about political mobilization and when politics or the political moves from a latent phase to a manifest phase. So when a conflict breaks out in society, when does it break out? And here are we at the ontological underpinnings of my position, actually. When does a conflict break out? It's not up to your own will. So there are no grounds for a voluntarist position that social actors or political activists could bring about antagonism, could bring about conflict by their sheer will through just now I want to create a conflict. This does not work. And we know as activists that you may time and again organize a public demonstration, but nobody will show up. And at one day, something happens, you don't know exactly why, and the streets are full with people. Why does this happen? You're doing exactly the same thing, but something else shifted, something else changed. And the reason for that is that the situation has, in a certain way, antagonized itself. There's something of what in French theory, which of course always goes back to Heidegger, you would call an event, something of the nature of an event. But that event, I think, has a name, and the name is antagonism, because antagonism is that which lies at the ground of every ontic conflict that emerges within the sphere of the social. And for that reason, that which brings us, or which subjectivizes us from, say, a couch potato into a political activist is nothing which we can look for in our own subjective consciousness. It is something external. And the external is antagonism. It is that which touches us. I'm making the point in my book about agitated being and being agitated. So whenever I feel agitated, touched by something that agitates me, I want to go to the streets, I want to demonstrate, like Black Lives Matter, or what I see these, videos of someone being killed, and it takes me to the street. Well, not every time we see these videos, people take to the streets. So something particular, in the constellation, the political constellation changed. And I feel agitated. But I feel agitated because I can only feel agitated because of the agitated nature of being, that is because of antagonism, because society is structured through conflicts. And these conflicts may pass from a latent to a manifest state at any given point, and you don't know exactly when this is going to happen. Nobody can predict it. Nobody predicted the disappearance of the Soviet Empire. Nobody predicted the outbreak of the Arab revolutions. Nobody can predict that. It just happens, And for that reason, I think that there is something external, and this external may serve as a resource for political activity, for political activism. But on the other hand, you cannot bring it about. You cannot bring it about, nonetheless, does not mean that you should stop trying to bring it about. I call this pre-enactment. So in the case of reenactment, which is very popular in the time-based arts, with Jeremy Dellis' Battle of Orgreave as a classical example, canonical example, you reenact a historical, in my case, a historical political event, like the Battle of Orgreave, for instance. A pre-enactment tries to pre-enact an event to come. And I think this is the role of art as a political practice, at moments where the situation is latent, the political situation is latent, the conflict is not there yet. You cannot really detect it. It has not broken out yet. What is your task as a political activist and as a political artist? It is trying to bring about conflict. It's trying to pre-enact a political situation which is not there yet. which is there only latently. But in order to do this, you have, in a certain way, to, go to the training ground. You have to start to act as if you could bring it about. You have to exercise your political skills, for instance. I give a couple of examples, or I analyze a couple of examples of artistic practices that do precisely this in my book. So you're sort of, is what in ballet, in classical ballet, you call exercise. At the bar, you do the basic movements so that at some point you may be able to dance Swan Lake. And that's the role of artistic practice.
Bien, Oliver, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros en esta entrevista. Espero que estés bien y hasta una próxima oportunidad. Adiós.
Thanks again. Thank you. Bye.